Hello and welcome to our webinar, Decoding GCF B.22. It's my pleasure to welcome each of you here today to analyze the latest developments at the Green Climate Fund. If you're joining this webinar series for the first time, my name is Grant Vallard-Tremere and I'm founder and CEO of the company ECO. If you're not familiar with us, ECO is a consultancy specializing in low-carbon, climate-resilient project design. We've designed over 250 climate change projects worldwide, and this year, 2019, marks our mobilization of over $1 billion of climate finance from major climate funds, including the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and the Adaptation Fund. Presenting in today's webinar will be a number of our consultants, including Marion Donant, who will be discussing our 11th GCF Insight publication, which this time focused on the Simplified Approval Process, SAP. This explored challenges to those developing SAP projects. Then we have Jasmine Hyman, who along with Marion attended the recent meeting of the board in Songdo, that's board meeting 22. And she'll give us a breakdown and analysis from the overall positive meeting. We'll also share a short segment from Titilope Akosa, who is the Executive Director of the Center for 21st Century Issues and the GCF Gender Monitor for Anglophone Africa. We recorded this at the board meeting in Songdo. Finally, there'll be a 20-minute Q&A where we can discuss your burning questions. Please do ask your questions in the chat section as we go along, and at the end, we'll answer them. If we don't manage to answer all of them, don't worry. We'll be sending out our toolkit along with a replay of the webinar, the slides, the GCF Insight report, and brief answers to all questions. So, let's get going. I'd like to introduce our senior consultant here at ECO, Marion Donant, who is based in Paris. Marion is a project design and evaluation specialist with 12 years of experience in the climate change and renewable energy sectors. Marion has successfully participated in GCF project design for several clients, including the World Bank, GIZ, AFD, BOAD, and UNHCR. Thank you, Marion.
We are going to present our last Insight report, which is about the Simplified Approval Process, the SAP. The SAP was approved by the GCF in 2017 as a recognition that there is a need to facilitate fast preparation, review, approval and disbursement of projects, especially from direct access entities. Projects that can apply for SAP should require less than 10 million USD of GCF contribution and have minimal environmental and social impacts. To date, six SAP projects have been approved by the GCF and half of them are from direct access entities. This means that the target of the GCF to have 50% of SAP from direct access entities is met. In this presentation, we will tell you about the experience and lesson learned from stakeholders with the SAP, the challenge they faced, and the recommendation on how to improve the process. We carried out a survey which got a high rate of response, including 142 respondents, and we also carried out an interview with the SAP team and accredited entity that have a SAP project approved. The survey showed that 74% of the respondents are somewhat to very familiar to the SAP, and 58% of them have been involved in the preparation of a SAP project. Several responses were collected from NDA, international accredited entities, direct access entities, entities wishing to be accredited, and NGO, public institution and consulting firm. The SAP team carried out several outreach activities in 2018, including 9 webinars, one called Explanatory Webinar on the SAP Pilot Scheme, also offered in Spanish and French. A practical manual for the preparation of SAP proposal is also available online. Several respondents indicate that the 3 most important sources of information on the SAP were first the SAP website, then the manual on SAP project on SAP proposal preparation, and finally the webinar on the SAP. As we can see in this figure, training scored the highest in terms of what proved the most useful source of information for respondents, followed by the manual on SAP and the webinars. In addition to this source of information, many respondents reported that it would be very useful if practical examples of success stories, case studies, and good practices could be made available to understand what a good project is. Several stakeholders reported that it is not clear where the simplification under the SAP are, and it would be helpful to highlight clearly how the SAP is simpler than the standard process. Respondents were asked to rate their capacity to develop a SAP proposal. Almost half of them considered they have a good to very good capacity. Those with lower capacity indicate that the priority to increase their capacity to develop SAP project is to train internal staff or hire external consultants. The SAP team is currently working with specialists of the GCF Secretariat to develop specific guidelines, which will be published by the end of March, on how SAP financing can be best used. The SAP team believes that this knowledge product can have an impact on improving the quality of SAP proposal and help entities that develop GCF SAP project to understand SAP requirements better. According to the SAP team, the knowledge project have had an impact in terms of increased number of submissions. However, it is too early to make an assessment concerning the impact or the quality of SAP proposals. Survey respondents were asked why they chose the SAP for the proposal. The most important reason reported is the simpler application process, which requires fewer supporting documents. Other reasons include a streamlined approval process, quicker disbursement, and recommendation by the GCF. Several respondents also emphasized that the SAP is also well adapted to small entities. Under the SAP, simplification is intended to be applied at four stages: preparation, review, approval, and disbursement. We will now explain where the simplifications are for these four stages. In terms of preparation stage, the SAP funding proposal template has been simplified by reducing the number of sections compared to the standard templates. Overall, the majority of respondents found that the SAP application process is easier. 27% remain neutral, 10% don't know, and 17% felt it requires the same amount of effort as the standard process. The feeling of this last group is that the SAP is a summary of the standard template, and there is no real saving in terms of time and effort to prepare the funding proposal, because the main GCF requirements still need to be met, and entities find very challenging to comply with the word limit. In several cases, entities have had to convert the full funding proposal into a SAP because it was recommended by the GCF, and they felt that it was very difficult to fully describe the project in the SAP template. As a result, the detailed description were moved into the annexes. According to our survey, the estimated level of effort for SAP concept note is 4.8 person months and 5.3 for the SAP full proposal. In 2016, we asked the same question on level of effort for a full proposal under the standard process, and the estimate level of effort was 21 to 34 person months. This appeared to indicate much lower level of effort for the SAP. From our experience, a SAP requires less time, but it is not clear if this comes from smaller category C project characterization or from the SAP simplification. Many stakeholders highlighted that the review process is not in line with the guidance provided by the SAP. They said that there are discrepancies between what is expected from entity in the SAP template and what is expected during the review stage. The SAP template requires specific information. However, during the review stage, it is possible for ITAP to request additional details. For instance, the SAP requires only to do a pre-feasibility study. The experience from one accredited entity with an approved project, SAP project, reported that ITAP requests inclusion of the same level of detail as a full feasibility study. Entities believe that ITAP seems to assess projects by adopting the same approach for SAP as for the standard process. According to the SAP team, average response time is around 4 weeks for the concept note, around 7 weeks for the funding proposal. Results from the survey indicate that the average response time is 4.2 weeks for the concept note and 10 weeks for the funding proposal. According to the SAP team, this trend is improving, and SAP average review time is shorter than the standard process. Time of approval ultimately depends on the quality of the proposal, and this is why the SAP team is prioritizing capacity building to entities. As it is the case for the standard process, timing for the SAP approval is also linked to the GCF board meetings. The GCF board is considering a new policy whereby SAP project could be approved all year round, and this will significantly reduce time between submission and approval. Finally, in terms of disbursement, this is an area the SAP team is currently working on. As most SAP proposals were approved recently, the SAP team are just starting to learn lessons on what is further needed in terms of faster streamline of post-approval documents. When asked what sort of challenges did the entity faced while developing their SAP project, many respondents outlined the same issues that would apply under the standard process. For instance, entity mentioned the challenge to define the theory of change or to justify the climate rationale. Many stakeholders highlighted the difficulty to summarize all the information requested within the SAP template, following the guidance of what information has to be provided. The less information required, the more difficult it is to contextualize the project, resulting in multiple questions for clarity from the GCF at the review stage. Respondents suggested several recommendations to improve the SAP process. For instance, to have more trainings, webinars to accredited entity or NDA, availability of SAP or SAP key contact to address specific questions, more information on successful application, to simplify even more the template, and to speed up the review process. Overall, again, the view is that the SAP should be really simplified. Since it is for lower risk project, there is a need to further simplify the assessments required and to soften GCF requirements. The SAP is an important value proposition that the GCF can offer to developing countries, especially to LDC and SITs. There was an overall positive impression from survey respondents. However, there is a limited consensus about the real simplification of SAP, especially during the review process. True quantitative data suggests level of efforts is reduced compared to the standard process. The feeling is that there is a need to align ITAP expectation and assessment with the SAP process. According to the SAP team, they are getting better equipped to provide technical support to the entity on how to complete the funding proposal. The focus of the SAP team is on offering capacity building so that the overall quality match the standard that the GCF expects and move faster in the review process and approval. According to the SAP team, it is expected that there will be a significant growing demand for SAP. Therefore, the Secretariat will have to deal with this growing demand to be ready and able to handle the large number of SAP submissions, especially once the pilot phase will be completed.
Thank you, Marion. Mel Fitaria, another of our senior consultants, who has over 20 years of climate experience in a wide range of sectors, including water, waste, food, communications, governance, livelihood development, disaster risk reduction, gender mainstreaming, emergency and humanitarian response, brings this diverse background to bear in our work. Mel also worked on the GCF Insight report that Marion described and will be available in our Q&A at the end to answer your questions. Please do send us chat messages along with those questions and we'll answer them. Now I'd like to introduce our principal consultant, Jasmine Hyman, who will be giving us an analysis of the recent GCF board meeting of the board. This is the 22nd board meeting. Jasmine has over 15 years of experience in climate-compatible development for vulnerable groups. Her current work at ECO specializes in designing climate change projects for environmental agencies and development banks. In 2016, Jasmine completed her doctorate at the Yale School of Forestry and the Environment, where she evaluated how technical, financial and managerial aspects of project implementation impact a project's overall effectiveness for mitigating climate change and stimulating the local economy at the household level. Thank you, Jasmine.
Thank you, Grant. It's my pleasure to be here. So today I'm going to talk about the results of the 22nd board meeting, and I'll just start with some of the key headlines. You've probably already read about them in the paper or through blog channels. Yannick Glemarek is the new executive director of the board. He was selected as the first item of business. This is exciting news for ECO because we know him and we've worked with him before, and he also brings a high degree of qualifications and expertise that will be relevant for the GCF. So we're quite pleased with the selection. There were also new co-chairs and board members and a new dynamic in the room. It was particularly exciting to see Joss Wheatley keep the board on track with characteristic British diplomacy and a very polite but firm hand. He really helped keep other board members focused on the agenda item before them and kept the meeting moving along. And that was really needed, a really needed new dynamic in the room. Mr. Johannes F. Lin was brought in as a global facilitator for the replenishment process to help identify country leads and to ensure that the timeline of activities leading up to the new pledges runs smoothly. And Germany and Norway, straight off the post, stated their intent to double their contribution for replenishment. So the meeting really started, that first day started on a high. In terms of approvals, there were a lot of smiles in the observer room, which sits on the 13th floor right above the boardroom. 9 projects were approved, spanning 13 countries and valued at $440 million. If you add in the $1.3 billion in pledged co-finance, the numbers look even rosier. So it was a really good day for project developers at the 22nd board meeting. And ECO was also really pleased. We had a project that we supported with BOAD for scaling up solar energy in the Sahel. And we were just really pleased to see a project proposed by a direct access entity that focused on least developed countries making its way accessing green climate funds. So that was great. Speaking of direct access, there were 9 new accredited entities that were approved, which was really good news and will help the pipeline move more quickly. And of them, 7 were direct access entities, meaning that they are local entities that are really in touch with local needs and can directly respond to the requests from their own host countries. In addition, there was even more good news. The Green Climate Fund approved an additional $122.5 million for their readiness program, which is, again, really important in terms of being able to help project developers and project designs get ready for the GCF approval process. So, yes, there were a lot of smiles. Then again, that evening, I ran into a board member, and I'll keep him anonymous just because he was sort of being cynical and off the record. And I said, wow, this is an amazing board meeting, so much better than the 20th board meeting where everything failed. And he said, well, these are just a whole bunch of projects that had been in the pipeline for a while and were ripe. Essentially, we're ready to be approved. But let's see how we perform tomorrow when we start to look at the policies. And, let's see if the old dysfunction appears. So the next day, we got to the policies. And I'm pleased to, by and large, report that this new face of the GCF board, this efficient and collaborative entity, did its work well. So we began with a report from the Independent Evaluation Unit, which is really this small, incredibly competent unit that performs independent evaluations of GCF performance and also could potentially review the performance of the board, although it's not doing that right now. But they presented their evaluation of the results management framework and pointed to a series of data gaps that they had uncovered in their research. And the board adopted the report in full and set a goal, mandated its secretariat to revise its performance measurement framework by the 24th board meeting. So that's ambitious, and it was really good to see the board so open to constructive critique. There was a closed executive session on some issues surrounding projects where the regulatory or the policy environment changes, or the project itself changes its strategy in a substantial way after receiving GCF board approval. And a new policy was agreed upon regarding the potential, basically underlying the possibility of canceling project funds for projects that have been restructured beyond recognition. I heard in the corridors and from a couple of stakeholders, I'm sure some people in the audience, that this really raises the risk profile of a GCF project and is going to make engaging with the GCF more expensive. On the other hand, this policy also improves the credibility of the GCF, in particular right before the replenishment. So my personal feeling about it, not as ECO, but as Jasmine Hyman, is that this is a positive thing. There's also a piloting of new investment criteria indicators, 19 of them. These indicators all point towards the project's ability to actually deliver on the 6 investment areas that the GCF has outlined. And ECO actually sent an intervention to Alexandra Tracy. She's the private sector observer who sits in the boardroom, regarding our concerns that the investment criteria indicators are highly qualitative, and they are also repetitive. And as it stands now in this new pilot program, project developers will be expected to provide, sub-indicators for all 19 of all of the investment criteria indicators. Sorry, it's a little bit of a tongue twister. I see this as overly onerous. I wish that the GCF would enable project developers to focus on 1 or 2 of the investment criteria and say, we're really going to make a huge impact here, and then to justify sub-indicators for meeting that investment criteria. I wish that it would allow project developers to focus in order to enable higher impact projects through the pipeline. We'll get to that later. Also, an interim policy on protection from sexual abuse, exploitation, and harassment was approved. This is a good thing. However, the real policy won't be discussed until the next board meeting, and that's a shame. It was on the agenda, and it just seems to be, for whatever reason, too hot a topic for the board to discuss on schedule. However, it was tabled to the next meeting, and a potential debate did not derail getting through the rest of the agenda, which was ultimately a good thing. Clarifications were also provided on the GCF's independent redress mechanism, which is good to see. So we see the institutions surrounding the GCF starting to make more sense. Language around the rights of somebody who brings up a complaint to the GCF, that they will not have to pay for the cost of raising that complaint. And finally, this isn't policy, but just to flag that the GCF internal evaluation, its performance review, is wrapping up, and there were a lot of surveys being done, long-form, semi-structured interviews happening in the corridors as the consultants who are supporting that performance evaluation did their round-the-clock work. I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of that evaluation, and I'm hopeful that the board is going to be open to hearing that feedback. We don't need to spend too much time on the slide. I just wanted to provide, this is from the GCF's own report on the results of the 22nd board meeting, just the geographic spread of the projects that were approved. And you can see that there's really a strong focus on the continent of Africa, and also the first RED Plus project was approved too in Latin America. So it does it was heartening to think of these projects being able to move to the next stage of implementation. Amid all of this good news, it wouldn't be a critical objective webinar if we didn't talk about something sticky. So I'm going to focus on consensus versus voting, which is this, this historic issue that comes up again and again at the GCF. The GCF, its origin story, which many of you already know, is that it was, it's a UN founded body, and the developing countries really felt that unlike the World Bank and the IMF, where where donor countries have more of a say in terms of the decisions for the GEF or for World Bank funds being released, that here the GCF would be one country, one vote. However, in practical terms, the one country, one vote means that there can be veto power from, all it takes is just one country that wants to derail the process, or maybe I should put that less harshly, all it takes is one country that, has an outlier opinion or isn't feeling particularly collaborative that day, can really slow down the working of the fund. And so the board has been discussing a variety of solutions, balloting, something sort of akin to, multiple rounds of decision making that eventually get down to a binary decision, and then there's, that people vote on that, but it's still by consensus. This idea, you can tell by the way that I'm fumbling as I try to describe it, is so complicated it's really hard to imagine how that would be applied to reviewing a project portfolio. There's also the idea that perhaps decisions could be made between meetings through bilateral discussions that could eventually build a consensus. And I think that this is probably, maybe a likely middle ground. However, there's the risk that non-transparent decision-making is also less robust. Then there's the idea that there could be a developed and developing country majority, so that you could have, as opposed to say that we're voting and that that developing countries could feel that they're being voted out, or developed countries could feel that they are being disenfranchised, that the two country groups could be divided, and that they would then need to have a majority among them. One thing to think about with these consensus versus voting discussions, and there was a long debate at the 22nd board meeting, and it didn't bear fruit, is that it might not even be important so long as the board has a general will to collaborate and to come to consensus. And that this new board dynamic, it's a little too soon to tell, but it appears to be more collaborative. It's unclear whether or not that's just because the developed and developing countries haven't had a chance to organize themselves into one single voice, or if it's a brand new feeling. But I'm hopeful that it's the latter. In any case, there's been no decision at present, but this is a little bit of background as to why the GCF, if you're watching from afar, why it can seem to get so gummed up in terms of its ability to make decisions. I just wanted to give a slide that provides a snapshot of the GCF portfolio at a glance, in particular as we start to think about the replenishment, the next phase of the GCF. So at present, there are 102 projects and programs. The GCF has allocated $5 billion for climate action in 97 developing countries. And if you combine that with the co-financing that accompanies the projects, then we are at $17.7 billion in climate finance, which is channeled through 84 accredited entities. The new approvals, we've mentioned this before, include the first RED Plus project in the Brazilian Amazon, and also the BOAD project that we participated in on scaling up solar energy in the Sahel, which is a direct access entity promoting climate change mitigation in least developed countries. A couple of firsts there. moving forward. So this wouldn't be an independent webinar assessing the GCF board meeting without our own take on where the GCF is now and what we'd like to see from the GCF moving forward. I just wanted to flag, so the GCF has just recently established, and by recent I mean last week, a communities of practice whereby project developers and private sector entities that are highly engaged with the GCF have been invited into a communities of practice with the understanding that this community will give feedback to the GCF and help reflect on the reality of developing projects that are seeking to access GCF funds. So I would really like to see this community of practice be an active and engaged channel. ECO will do its bit to make that a reality. And I also want to invite you, if it's relevant, to come to us with your own reflections on the GCF, and we'll do our best to send that message across. ECO would also really like to see clarity on board governance with full respect for the historical origins of one country, one vote. It would nonetheless be great and really needed to see clarity and predictability from the GCF. So this is something that we hope that will be bundled into the next replenishment process. Clarity, predictability, and less information asymmetries between project developers and the GCF Secretariat. We'd also like to see focused application of the new investment indicators and the new investment criteria indicators. And what I mean here is, is that I understand that the GCF needs to be all things to all countries. That is both the philosophical beauty and the practical bane of the United Nations. And I'm speaking personally here, not as ECO, but that's something that I fully support, is the mission of the United Nations and its approach to robust decision-making processes. However, this desire, this need for the GCF to be all things to all parties means that there's not a lot of focus within the board or within the institution, and that makes it really difficult to write high impact, effective projects with any type of efficiency and at the scale needed. And so my suggestion would be that project developers would be allowed to choose a couple of the investment criteria to really focus on and to say this project is going to make a huge difference in terms of paradigmatic change, and then to be asked to justify which indicators they will use to back up those claims. Just for 2 or 3, sure, all six of the investment criteria should be addressed, but to allow us to prioritize within projects, so that because not all projects are going to be able to leverage the same amount of co-finance or to be able to meet the same type of external targets. Not all projects can do all things. We're also really excited, this is ECO and me, about the GCF performance evaluation, and it is expected that it will provide specific recommendations on how to make the application of the investment criteria more practical, and we're really eager and excited to see how the board responds to those recommendations. And finally, ECO would like to see increasing country leadership towards the replenishment. I know that the UK is quite actively seeking input as to how its contribution to the GCF can be most effective, and this is really a time of reflection for all donors to the GCF to think about, well, what do we want to see from this truly important institution going forward. Finally, I spoke to the Executive Director of the Center for 21st Century Issues. She is also the GCF Gender Monitor for Anglophone Africa. And so I'm going to leave shift the presentation to Titilope Akosa. Thank you so much for your willingness to speak on our webinar.
Yeah, my name is Titilope Akosa. I'm the Executive Director of Center for 21st Century Issues, a non-governmental organization based in Lagos, Nigeria. I'm also the Green Climate Fund Gender Monitor for Africa. Yeah, what I would really like to say in terms of the GCF support to gender, first of all, is to ensure that we have a new gender policy which has been on the table for a very long time. And at BM22 now, that the board says they want to look at it again, and then they've pushed it to BM23. For me, it's a lot of delay. Yeah, gender needs to be improved in terms of country ownership. Because at the country level, we have different gender contexts. There are different gender issues that will be thrown up at the country levels. So it is very important that country ownership takes account of this, because country ownership will look at the priority of each country, what is their climate change needs, and then look at the financing aspect of it. And then it's also very important that the most vulnerable, women, indigenous groups, also benefit from the Green Climate Fund that is coming into the country. Also in terms of capacity building, how do we mainstream gender into country ownership? And after mainstreaming it, how do we ensure that it delivers on the ground?